Hi Nick, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you.
So I'm so excited to talk to you again. It's so funny because it's been 1 month since I spoke to you on my podcast, Crypto Native, and then I feel like we had a really great conversation. And now 1 month later, I'm the community manager at ENS. So that's been really incredible for me. And I feel like in the month that I've been at ENS, something that I have discovered from being on the team that I didn't know as just a user of ENS and as Alicia.eth on Twitter is kind of just how much has gone into building ENS and the story behind it. And so I was really excited I am really excited to talk to you a lot about the early days of ENS and just everything that you've been through, because I feel like in the last couple of months, as you know, .eth names on Twitter have really taken off. And I feel like we're kind of reaching some sort of tipping point with ENS. And so I feel like something that would be really valuable for the whole community would be to just learn a bit more about how everything started. And because it feels, like a lot of fun if you're joining the community like in the last couple of months. But I feel like for you, maybe it's been a really kind of, maybe not so long, but, definitely a journey. So I wonder, just going all the way back to you joining the Ethereum Foundation and kind of that time in your life, like what was that like, and kind of what did you feel so excited about with Ethereum in general that kind of made you take that leap?
I guess, it was a little intimidating because all of my professional experience prior to then had been full-time employment, and suddenly I was taking the leap to being a contractor, to working remotely where I was the only person in my city, like working for the EF, and that city was London, so not exactly a small one, to honestly, like taking a big pay cut as well, which I all did though, because I was really, really excited about Ethereum. And I guess it comes from, I'm a huge nerd. And I really like computer science, and I really like software, and I love the theoretical sort of fundamentals underlying it. And I remember so many times like playing around with this sort of thing, with just like low level computer stuff growing up, and thinking about like how cool would it be if you could have like this fairly computer that people could program. And like people rubbish the whole world computer thing because it was fairly missold in terms of what people understood it to mean. But the idea that you can have this execution environment where everybody knows that programs execute the same way and have the same result, and have that run in a way that's sort of universal and doesn't require any sort of trusted third party. That was really exciting. Like I'd looked into Bitcoin a couple of times, like years before, and been like, oh, kind of cool, but doesn't seem very scalable. And, it's just money, like it's just moving money around. It didn't seem that interesting to me. But then with Ethereum coming along with like programmability and the ability to like build your own consensus systems in it, that I thought was really exciting. And so I basically started playing with it as soon as I found out about it. And it only took, I think, like a couple of months after that before I got a call from the EF saying, would you like to come join the EF, and work on either Go Ethereum or Swarm. And so I sort of, after a short hesitation about the nature of like giving up the certainty of a full-time job, took the plunge.
Wow. And what year was that?
That was 2016.
Wow. Okay. And so in terms of what led to that call, was that just you creating projects and like working in public and like pushing your code?
Pretty much, yeah. I think the thing that attracted attention most was I wrote a really early Solidity string manipulation library. And prior to that, there were like a few sort of ad hoc functions people had coded up, but nothing, slightly more coherent. So I put that out and it gained some popularity, and I think that attracted some attention.
Wow. Okay. So that's really interesting that kind of whether you are non-technical in this space, like me, kind of creating content, or whether you are technical and creating code, that it works the same way, that kind of proof of work in this space works the same way. So I think that's really cool. So Okay, that's really exciting. And so then you're at the Ethereum Foundation in 2016, and like how many people are in that team? Or
I was initially working on the Swarm team, which was probably about four of us, I think, maybe
wow.
five. And after a short period, I switched over to the Go Ethereum team, which was a similar size. In fact, I think it was just three of us at one point.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, they were fairly small teams, and the EF itself was a lot smaller. Although still bigger than like ENS is today, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think that is one of the most shocking things, learning that the ENS team has kind of done so much with so few people. But I think that speaks volumes about the people who are already on the team, especially yourself. So, okay, so then you're happy working on at the Ethereum Foundation, everything's going really well, and you're like fulfilling your childhood dreams. And then how does ENS kind of come about?
So one of the first things I worked on when I joined the Swarm team was they needed some sort of naming system because they were publishing content to Swarm, or that was their intention, and they needed a way for people to access it in a human readable fashion. Big long identifiers weren't good enough, and so one of the first things I picked up was that, and my very early first version was based on DNS, more or less. It was quite closely mirrored DNS. And I was sort of seeking to address this inadequacy that there had been a couple of attempts at naming things on Ethereum, but they were all extremely basic. They were, you can have a name and it points to the account that owns it. And that was it. There were no subdomains. There was no ability to have it point at multiple different types of resources, or to have it point at a different address than the one that controls it, and so forth. It was very, very limited, and so I wanted to build something more extensible. And so I left the Swarm team, but I kept working on the naming system, even after moving to the Geth team. And the second revision was pretty much what you see today in ENS. So it kept the extensibility and the flexibility and the sort of the permissionlessness, the fact that you don't need some central upgrade to enable some new feature. But it restructured the system to fit better with the constraints of Ethereum rather than the constraints of 1980s computers that were first connected to the internet.
Yeah. And so when you're thinking about things like now, if you start from this point where you're using DNS and that system to build ENS, but then how does that kind of play out? Because I feel like it's lasted really well. Like that original idea that you had has really stood the test of time so far. And so are you thinking very long term when you're thinking about things, or is it a very iterative kind of step where you're just okay, let's just solve for this problem human readable names so that the Swarm team can use them? Or are you really thinking about ENS could be the DNS of the blockchain when you start it?
I guess DNS of the blockchain seemed like a reasonable thing to build for, and my goal is always to build a system that's simple but extensible. That it meets its goals with as little additional complexity as possible, but it allows for later expansion and so forth. And so, the key thing in ENS was that we have the central registry, which is not really upgradable, but it just does a very simple mapping step. It just lets you look up what is the contract that's responsible for this name, and then everything else is built into that contract. And so that means that you can add features just because you own a name. You don't need to upgrade the whole system like most things require. And so adding that sort of layer of indirection, that one additional step, gives you all that flexibility without a lot of complexity. And that's always what I try and work towards if I'm building something new that I want to last.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, that's really exciting. And I suppose that also just opens the door in terms of the potential ENS ecosystem, because the number of times, I can't imagine how many DMs you get of people sliding into your DM saying, is ENS doing this? And is your reply, I feel like my reply now is the core team isn't doing that, but we would love for someone in the community to build that. That's the point, that it's open and anyone can extend it in any way.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess I'd say we've made more changes to the the permissioned part of ENS, the bit that requires like somebody to upgrade things, than I anticipated when I first launched. But the vast majority of the changes that have been made, either by us or by someone else, have been, done without anybody's central permission or approval or anything like that. And so it largely works the way it is intended. And yeah, I get a lot of DMs, and typically my answer is exactly what you say.
Yeah. Is there anything that you're really looking forward to being built, kind of using or integrating ENS in this space?
So I guess the thing I really love seeing stuff built on subdomains and so forth, and anything around that, because it lets you create your own sort of sub ecosystem that can have whatever rules and permissions you want. And we're releasing soon something called a name wrapper, which allows for making that sort of thing a lot easier. So I'd be really excited to see what people build on top of that once they have to write less code themselves and can rely on sort of standard building blocks more.
The subdomain name wrapper is something I'm so excited about. Someone just commented in the Discord yesterday, and they said, I listened to Brantley on a Twitter Spaces talking about subdomains, and I get it, like, that everything can have a subdomain, like and I was like, yes, you get it. You see it, like not only every person, like as Brantley says in the known universe, but every object, like everything, literally everything could have a subdomain, which is so exciting. And it's really interesting thinking in such an expansive way. I wonder how, like, having been in the space now for many years, is that your default to think very, courageously, I guess?
Well, I guess, like, my attitude towards building systems is to make them as extensible and long-lasting as possible. But my attitude to actually launching things is to assume that they probably won't work. So I try and build a system that will do really well if it's massively successful, but I've lost track of the number of like cool little projects I've put out that just haven't got traction. So kind of a hybrid of both, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And so when ENS is deemed to be kind of more than a side project and something that you can spend all of your time on, what does that look like in terms of, I mean, we know how it would work in Web 2 or in kind of a traditional tech environment where you might go out and get funding and then you have money to pay yourself and bring on some team members and build this thing. How did it work with ENS in this ecosystem?
So it gradually took up more and more of my time while I was still on the Geth team, and I sort of did that with the approval of my boss on the Geth team, and also with the approval of like the director of the EF. But eventually it got to the point where I wasn't really doing much or any Geth work, and it was pretty much all ENS stuff. And the EF at the time was like sort of going through some changes in terms of like trying to decide how they should handle decentralization. And so their suggestion was like, basically I think I'd already asked, could we have like a team? Could I actually have like an ENS team and headcount and stuff? And they basically said, well, maybe not, but we're working towards decentralizing more, and one of the things we're considering is to like spin out successful ENS projects into their own organizations. So how about we make ENS the guinea pig for this, basically. You write us up a proposal, spin out into a new not-for-profit organization, and we'll write you a grant check to get you started. And who knows, maybe more grant checks later, depends how you do, really. And so I did that. I wrote up a proposal. I figured out there were a couple of core contributors who had been volunteering their time or who had done some work on very low remuneration basis because it was all I could sort of afford at the time, who I thought would make excellent sort of founding members of an independent ENS team. And so I asked them and I wrote up a proposal and I figured out what I thought would be, I think it was 18 months or 2 years worth of runway. And I submitted it and I said, here's what I want. Can you give us $500,000? And I was like, oh my God, I'm asking for a lot of money. And apparently it went all the way to Vitalik, who looked at it and said, this is entirely inappropriate. $500,000 isn't nearly enough. And they gave us $1 million instead.
Wow.
So, it wasn't like no strings attached. We had like goals to meet in order to get each part of the grant and stuff like that. And, it was very sensible in terms of like making sure we actually did something with the money rather than just sat on our butts. But it was very generous, and it was instrumental in getting ENS like running and viable as an independent organisation. So then we started being a separate org and setting our own goals. And that also meant that we could pick our own targets. We'd still try and meet the things in the grant goals, but to sort of decide how we wanted to approach it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting now hearing that story about the EF and the proposal and the grant with ENS, and now, what just happened with ENS and EF getting together to do the proposal and a grant for sign-in with Ethereum. And so I wonder, just as a way of doing things, of kind of bringing projects to life and giving people a pathway to kind of do the work, how do you feel about that kind of process in general?
I think it can be pros and cons, really, because it can be quite high overhead. I think ENS team got off quite lightly on this because there was already sort of inertia in the organisation, like momentum in the EF to do this and to get us into our own org. So it was a relatively straightforward process. But from what I've seen of grant issuing, like both at the EF and elsewhere in general, like where somebody comes with a whole new idea, there can be a lot of overhead and a lot of time involved in getting to the point of actually having the funding for it. And so there's ideas like, retroactive grants, where you basically, somebody builds something cool and then you go, you deserve to be paid for this, and you pay them for it, which I think is an awesome idea. But it also has its own like drawbacks, because it means that only the people who can afford to actually dedicate the time to building it without, external money end up building stuff. So I don't know if there's an ideal solution, because there's also there's a lot of sort of easy money sloshing around, and there's also a lot of people who will promise the world and not deliver a lot. So you don't want to be, oh yeah, just anybody comes to us with a great idea and we'll write you a check, because then you end up wasting it, So it's a really difficult problem.
Yeah, it almost seems like it needs to be an ecosystem solution, because no one party or organization can take on kind of dealing with all of the different angles of trying to solve this problem. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I think like any organization that's doing this, there's a tendency to be quite conservative and to be afraid of wasting money, and to say, and to add all these extra barriers and bureaucracy to getting a grant to try and prevent ever giving it to someone who won't deliver. But I think it's worth recognising that there are costs to that as well. So you're not trying to be in a position where you never ever give out a grant that isn't well spent. You're trying to balance the cost of poorly spent grants against the cost of not giving grants to organisations that could have made a huge difference. So it's difficult, but people need to recognise it's a balance, not just all the way over here at the extreme.
Yeah, I had a really good way of thinking about this recently on a podcast, and basically this person said that they like to believe in people and give people kind of the benefit of the doubt, and give them all of the responsibility and things like that, and the ownership, and then it's accepted that some people will not deliver or will let you down, and they just think about that as like a single digit tax on the huge upside potential of just like being very kind of generous and optimistic as a baseline.
Yep, I pretty much agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so having the grant get started and then having a team, I wonder in terms of, where ENS started as like the intention with the human readable, mapping a human readable name to a wallet address, to where it is now. I feel like where this idea of a Web3 identity has really taken hold of not the narrative of ENS, but I think that people really identify with this idea of identity in Web3 now. So what has that been like in terms of like what you're thinking about within the ENS team, to seeing how the ecosystem and the community respond to it and how they see it?
So interestingly, like the first use case for ENS wasn't actually wallet address at all. It was a swarm hash. for looking
Oh,
up
right.
Swarm content. And pretty much from day one, I was like, well, obviously this would be really good as a way to identify wallets as well.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I always thought that wallet addresses would get penetration faster and more effectively than Swarm or any other decentralized content thing. But right from day one, we had the idea that it could be used to address multiple resources. And, the two that we had in mind initially were wallet addresses and distributed content. But, although I built it to be extensible and I hoped people would use it for a variety of things, I didn't really foresee the expansion of importance of it as an identity and so forth. And particularly, I built in reverse resolution, which we're now calling a primary ENS name.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that you can look up an account and say, which name is associated with this, as opposed to the regular process where you start with a name and get an account. I built it in almost as an afterthought because I was like, well, we're modeling after DNS. DNS has this. It's not used much in DNS, but it is occasionally useful. So I should build it in, because it'll be useful from time to time. And I didn't really foresee just how useful it would be, which I should have, because you look at a site like Etherscan, and it's just pages of addresses, and being able to turn that into something that's recognizable immediately is really valuable.
Yeah. Wow. And so can you just talk me through reverse records as a concept? Because I feel like it is very groundbreaking for a lot of people to wrap their head around. Mm-hmm. And how does that work?
So at its most basic, the idea is if you own an ENS name, you can point it at an address. So then when somebody enters the ENS name into a wallet or whatever, it will resolve to that address, meaning you can send funds to it, you can look it up to see account details or whatnot. Reverse resolution or primary ENS name is the reverse of that, as the name implies. So the idea is you start with an account address, which maybe you got from an explorer, or you were looking up a transaction history, or somebody signed in with it or whatever, anywhere where they wouldn't have been manually typing it in. And instead you want to show something human readable to the people viewing your app. So you have a sign-in widget in the corner, and you want to show them their ENS name. But somebody can own multiple ENS names and they can point at multiple accounts and so on. So you need a way to say, this is the name I want to be associated with this account. There are many, but this is the one that I see as my primary identity. And so that's what you can do here to say, to pick a name that points at your address and say, this is the one I should be identified by.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, that's really exciting, and starting to see dApps using it, like being able to sign into 1inch or Uniswap, and Showtime and things like that, and to see your ENS identity in action is really exciting. And I know that we just released the NFT avatar, being able to see your avatar as an NFT, which is really exciting, and it's making it all feel very Web3 native, which is really interesting. And I wonder, in terms of thinking about ENS, because I feel like it is the most kind of crypto native evolution of identity compared to, even though you started with DNS, I feel like potentially there is a window to try to just replicate DNS for Web3, and these kind of Web 2 ideas. But I feel like ENS goes further than that. And I wonder, in terms of what makes ENS so crypto native, is it kind of your time spent here and the team's time spent here, or do you think it's just the community? I wonder how ENS kind of just stays out ahead of everything.
It's a bit of both, I think. We've always tried to focus on the features and so forth that are actually really useful to people, mm-hmm. And to try and not be so fixated on our own vision of what ENS should be that we miss what people are actually using it for. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been driven by the community, and then us picking up on what's actually useful from the community and building on that has been really valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder, just kind of thinking about the community and looping back to .eth names, and especially on Twitter, I know that we mentioned in our previous conversation that you were probably the first person to set your .eth name on Twitter.
I'm pretty sure I was. Originally it was Nick Johnson in brackets Nick.eth, mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure I was the first person to do that.
Yeah. And so what do you think it is? So I actually just had my first ENS fairy moment, which was really great for me, and gifted a friend their name.eth, and they just changed their Twitter name to it. And I remember watching validator.eth do it earlier this year on Twitch streams and on Twitter and things like that. And it really just completely exemplified to me everything that was so wonderful and wholesome about this community. And so I wonder for you, like, what does the .eth Twitter name kind of represent, and why do you think it's captured hearts and minds on Twitter like it has?
It's kind of blown me away, because initially, like, just to me, it was a practical thing of saying, like, hey, I'm using ENS, here's my ENS identity, like, if you want to interact with it in some way. And also just, a little bit of an advertisement, saying, for ENS. But it's really taken over, because I think it serves multiple purposes. Like, it's a very easy and evocative signal that, hey, I use Ethereum, and, that I want to associate that with my identity. And at the same time, it's a practical handle that you can use to identify the person's public persona. So I guess it's just that combination of, like, in-group signaling and actually useful asset is what's driven it. But I've been enormously surprised by how far it's spread. And, there was a period there where we were seeing people who were, like, setting it as their handle, because all they saw was other people setting it as their handle, but they didn't understand that it was actually associated with this thing called ENS, and that you had to register a name. So they would just, like, pick their name and add .eth, and so it took a while for our communication around that to catch up with the actual spread of the meme,
Wow. Yeah, actually, I have, when I do see people with the .eth name, especially if they're new to Web3, I sometimes do a quick check just to make sure that they have it, and then send them a kind DM saying, you can also buy this on ENS, so you actually own the .eth. And so in terms of, I guess, all of the mechanisms that are in place with ENS, especially because people who are buying .eth names, in a lot of instances, it is one of the first things that you do when you kind of make that commitment to Web3 and crypto. And so kind of having an understanding of all of the mechanisms at play with ENS, I think is really useful. And I feel like a lot of questions that we get kind of from the community are around pricing, and just maybe how the pricing, like the different experiments that you've done with pricing over the last couple of years, and then also kind of how the team have landed with the mechanisms that they have in place. So I wonder if you could just give us, like, a brief history of, like, how that all evolved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the original system was based on an auction, and it was, largely as a result of discussions between Alex van der Sand and me, and he was a very strong proponent of not just the auction model, but also of locked deposits, which is what we used in the initial version. So right back at the very start in 2017, names were released progressively, and as each name became available, it started an auction process using something called a Vickery auction. You would put down your bid during the auction period, and then during the reveal period you'd reveal it, and whoever won would get the name, but they would only pay as much as the second highest bidder, which is what makes it a Vickery auction. And then that amount wasn't, like, given to the team or burned or anything. It was locked up in an account that was held there for as long as you retained the name. So the idea was that it provided a sort of a constant incentive to release the name if you no longer needed it, because you'd get your money back.
Right.
And in some ways that was kind of quite premature, like it was very early. These days, if you did something like that, you would be able to do things like you'd have services that would, like, pay for your deposit for you in return for, like, a monthly fee, because they would, that basically be staking for you. And you'd have services that would let you borrow against your deposit, and, and so on and so forth. And the system, like, the goal was good, but we sort of discovered the unintended side effect of this really is that it effectively made it cheaper for speculators and squatters than it did for legitimate users. Because if I bought Nick.eth, not that was available back then, but for a deposit of 1 ETH, I have to assume that deposit is gone forever because I don't want to ever release nick.eth and get my, to get my 1 ETH back.
Right.
And of course, if the price of ETH skyrockets, that might seem like a much less reasonable price than it did at the time when it was $30 or whatever. On the other hand, if I'm a speculator, I am intending to flip the name. And when I flip the name, I get paid off, and I can reasonably expect the person buying it will pay more than the deposit because they could always release it for that. And so therefore, my capital's only locked up for as long as I'm sitting on the inventory. Effectively, it has, very, very low cost for me. And so that was very much an unintended effect. And that became apparent in time. And so the other issue was like the usability. Like the auction system made a lot of sense for initial release of the name. And I'm a big fan of systems that ensure fair allocation of new assets. But after the initial auction period, it didn't make a lot of sense to have to wait 5 days to register an ENS name when you were almost certainly the only one trying to register that name because the chances of multiple people wanting it at the same time are quite low. So I think it was 2 years on because we announced right on day one that this was going to be the interim system, and 2 years in we would aim to replace it. So 2 years in we replaced it with the current system, which is basically instant registration and an annual fee, which is very similar to how DNS works. And a little disappointing in some ways because we tried all these innovative things and we worked through all these things and we ended up coming back to a very sort of ordinary system. But it has the advantage that it makes it more expensive for people to just buy names and sit on them and not use them, while keeping the cost quite low for people who just want a name to name their project. And then the third thing we did in terms of pricing was we made another couple of changes. One was we released names that were shorter. So initially the limit was 7 characters or more. We made 3, 4, 5, and 6 character names available. And for 3 and 4 character names, there's a substantial premium just because there's so few of those names that are available. And then the other thing we did was when names were coming up for expiry, and we didn't want a situation where we had gas wars over popular names that were expiring. So we set up what's called a temporary premium, which is another sort of auction, basically. It's a Dutch auction. So when a name expires, it becomes available, but if you want to register it straight away, there's a premium which starts at $2,000, and that diminishes to zero over a period of a couple of weeks. So if you want to wait, you can wait until it's the normal price. If you think it's worth a bit extra, you can get it then, but the idea is that it makes it available to you when it's a good price for you, rather than rewarding somebody who writes a bot that snaps it up the very second it's available.
Right. Yeah. My first exposure to ENS was looking for Alicia.eth, and when I saw it, it had dropped into this temporary premium state and was on an auction and coming down, and I thought it was the coolest thing. I know though that people can feel that it can feel very unfair for a user to see a name that is available for registration jump straight to $2,000 and then kind of go down to the normal price for over 28 days. But I wonder, just kind of digging into that idea of basically being an incentive for utility rather than speculation. And in terms of, people writing scripts for bots or writing bots to pick up names, is that a real threat, and does that happen?
I think it's a real threat. We see it a lot with systems that haven't designed with this in mind. Like the obvious example is NFT drops.
Right.
It isn't something we've seen a lot for ENS because we've taken a lot of precautions to try and discourage it.
Yeah.
With the reason registering a name takes 2 transactions instead of 1 is because we were concerned that with just 1, somebody would front run registrations. So they would see an incoming registration, they'd grab the name before you could grab it, and then they'd offer it up to sale to you at an inflated price. And they wouldn't even have to be successful most of the time. If they offer it for 10 times the normal price and they get rejected 8 times out of 10, they're still doubling their money. You know? So I think these are real risks, and I think that people that design systems that run on Ethereum and the blockchain without thinking about them will get wrecked eventually, if not immediately, or their users will rather, which is worse.
Yeah. Well, I think this is really interesting because it kind of brings to the forefront this idea that an ENS name is an NFT, which is very easy to forget because I think the one-to-one comparison is that it's like a domain name, but for Web3. But really, an NFT is very, very different to a domain name. So I wonder in terms of what is so exciting about the fact that ENS is an NFT. And I know we've kind of touched on this with subdomains in the name wrapper, but how do you think about that and why is that so exciting?
I guess like the obvious thing that comes to mind, but in my mind the most boring, is the fact that you can trade them like other NFTs. Mm-hmm. They show up in OpenSea and so on. But that seems kind of trivial and not that interesting to me. The thing that I find most exciting is that they're composable. So and that they implement the same interface, so you can transfer them on a bridge to an L2. You can use them in a game or anything that uses NFT items. You can compose them with other NFTs and collections and so forth. One thing that came up recently is there's the thing called the Guild that's doing an alpha, and they support NFTs, which means they support ENS. Mm-hmm. So you can create a chat channel that's only for people with ENS names or only for people with short ENS names. And all of these things, like, neither we nor the Guild had to do any special support for that, because they were able to just grab the stuff that we have because it's already directly supported, because it's an NFT. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think is coolest about it, is just the fact it's an open ecosystem and it's a common protocol that everything uses.
Yeah. And I wonder just quickly, in terms of the NFT standards, can you just run through where ENS is, like what an ENS name is at the moment, and then how that might change in the future?
So at the moment, ENS names, like in the registry, are not they're our own standard, because it was actually written before NFTs existed. Wow. And so they're a type of NFT, but it's specific to ENS. Mm-hmm. .eth names are ERC721 NFTs, which are the sort most people are familiar with. Mm-hmm. But that only applies to .eth names that are second level domains. So nick.eth is an ERC721 NFT. Buy.nick.eth is not. It's a subdomain. And so then finally there's the wrapper, which we're planning to release, and that will allow wrapping any name at any level into an NFT. And that'll be an 1155 NFT, which is a newer sort and, in my opinion, better standard for NFTs. And that means that like any name can be an NFT, and you can also set things up so that, for instance, you could own wallet.eth and you could give out subdomains of wallet.eth, which would be NFTs, mm-hmm. but also that you can't claw back off the people you sold them to. So people can be sure that they're actually going to continue to own that name.
Wow. I feel like that is really exciting. It's like this idea that things that you could come together in community, but that could also be viewed as like a point of centralization, but that mm-hmm. it is still kind of trustless in the sense that the ultimate holder of the ENS name couldn't rug the users with subdomains. So I feel like This is so exciting to think about, like the bundling and unbundling of power, and how the user still retains so much power with this kind of, with this standard.
Yeah, and like I love the idea of how you can combine these things too. Mm-hmm. So you could write a contract that issues subdomains of your domain.eth, and then you could set up a guild chat channel so that the only people who are allowed in it are people who own subdomains. So then now your contract on Ethereum governs the membership of a Discord channel, and also everybody gets a name into the bargain. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. I feel like as well, when you say subdomains, we think of subdomains as you could just have like a few things that are subdomains, but my mind has started ticking about so many things in my life just with my own .eth name, with my own ENS name, that could be a subdomain. And so I feel like in terms of thinking really creatively about uses for subdomains, is there anything that kind of really excites you? I know that, Brantley uses can use them for family members and things like that, so first name, last name, but I don't know, what's on your mind with what can be done?
So as part of our L2 stuff, we're working on wildcard support. And with the wildcard support, all sorts of subdomain things become possibilities. So, an exchange could give out ENS names for every user. So it'd be like your username.exchange.eth. But you could also do things like you could create a name so that every numeric subdomain refers to a specific NFT token. So, 123.punks.eth could refer to punk number 123, or it could refer to the owner of punk number 123. So if you own punk 123, you could just say, oh yeah, send me a token at 123.punk.eth. You can do even wilder things like there's the system called, there's sort of broadly speaking two types of naming systems. There's objective naming systems like ENS, where everybody has the same view of all the names. And there's pet naming systems or subjective naming systems where I decide what I'm going to call a bunch of accounts and you decide what you're going to call them and so on. But in pet naming systems, you can also sort of take that a step further. I could go like, I call your account Alicia, and you call Vitalik's account Vitalik, but maybe I don't have a record for that. I could go like Vitalik.Alicia, which is like look up the person who Alicia calls Vitalik.
Oh my gosh.
And so you could build something like that in ENS using subdomains, so you just nest them and it automatically resolves one after the other sort of thing.
Wow, I just that was funny. It was like seeing the idea land in real time.
Yes.
But okay, that's really, oh my goodness. I'm not ready for this. I'm like just wrapping my head around Web3 identity and getting really excited about that. But as soon as we drop that subdomain wrapper feature, I think that kind of, I'm so excited to see what people do with that. And I wonder as well, just with NFTs, and I feel like you maybe have a general interest and curiosity when it comes to like NFTs. And I've noticed that you collect a few pieces yourself. And so what is that like for you being a collector, and what's your interest in it?
I don't collect that much, but a bit, like sort of whatever interests me.
Yeah.
I got involved in NFTs a bit right back at the very start because I was an active EIP editor at the time, and the team behind CryptoKitties were trying to standardize a standard for NFTs, and I got involved in like offering feedback and commentary on that. And then when they were launching CryptoKitties, they offered like a bug bounty, and so I guess I could probably rightly say that I was like the first person ever paid a bounty for finding a bug in an NFT contract.
Wow.
For which they gave me like some trivial amount of ether that I forget, but also like a limited edition kitty. And so, I've had some involvement right from the very beginning, but not like, I'm not a heavy duty collector or anything.
Yeah.
I've picked up things that interest me. I've got a few ether cards because ether cards was originally a project of my own, doing something totally different that I sold to a comba because I didn't have time to manage it on my own. I've got a few other things that just like where I particularly like the creators or I particularly like the art or something like that. I do feel like a lot of it is out of reach even to someone like me who's been native to it for a long time. Like unless I'm prepared to invest, ridiculous amounts of money in it, it does feel like a lot of it is quite stratospheric at the moment.
Yeah. And I wonder just in terms of kind of thinking about the amounts of money and, seeing everything represented as an Ethereum like price when you're transacting, and just taking into account gas wars and just gas prices in general at the moment, what do you think about kind of the state of gas's impact on adoption and just general use?
I think it's reached the point where I think it's impacting a lot of things that would be good uses for Ethereum, but are no longer economically feasible. We're not going to have the whole, Ethereum isn't going to turn into a ghost town. It's the saying of like, oh, nobody goes there, it's too busy, But it's definitely hedging out the things that would be more affordable for people in favor of the higher value things. And I do think that's a shame. But at the same time, we're getting L2s are becoming more practical roll-ups and other efforts around that. So hopefully those things will start migrating to those systems. And I'm really encouraged that some of those systems don't make enormous trade-offs in favor of centralization in order to get more throughput. Like they're managing to remain very decentralized and trustless while still massively increasing the transaction capacity.
Yeah. And then ENS's position on L2s, I've heard you talk about it, but can you just kind of give me a snapshot of where that's at?
Yep. So for the foreseeable future, the ENS registry, like the core component, will be on Ethereum.
Mm-hmm.
But the goal is, first of all, to enable it, to make it possible to move subdomains or move domains and all their subdomains to the L2 or external system of your choice. So if you register wallet.eth and you want to hand out subdomains, you could hand out subdomains on Optimism or on Arbitrum or on any other system. And therefore do so with minimal or no gas fees for your users. And your users could then set ENS records and so forth, again, without paying any L1 gas fees. So the idea is that for the majority of users, they should have minimal costs using ENS. Longer term, we may move like .eth itself. We could move to an L2 so that you can register .eth names for much lower transaction cost. But whereas our initial approach works with like every L2 and permits like, let 1,000 flowers bloom sort of approach, this would require us to pick one. And I feel like it's too early to pick a single L2 as like this is where all .eth names live, or at least where they live by default,
Yeah.
So we want to be a little cautious about like picking a winner there. But at the same time, we have this approach that works for reducing the fees enormously for most users without having to do that, letting our users choose where they want their names to live.
Yeah. And what's the time frame on that for with subdomains and things like that?
We'd like to have something usable out by the end of the year, is our goal, with the interference of like the holiday season and so on. Maybe that will be a little difficult, but we have code that works, and we need to polish it, and we need to like make it work with a practical L2 rather than with our own sort of test environments and stuff. But I think that's achievable, probably initially not with like fancy UIs because that takes a little while to develop. So it might be a little bit of an advanced user thing at first.
Okay, cool. And then the other thing I was going to ask about was just the grace period, just while we're talking about kind of like all of the mechanisms with ENS, the grace period of 90 days and where that kind of came from, maybe the DNS inspiration.
Yep. Yeah, the initial idea was like we don't want somebody losing their name because they were a day late to renew it or because they forgot about it. So the idea was to give a fairly generous grace period during which they can still renew their name and retain it. And so that people can't just, snipe it out the moment it expires. And the idea was to sort of restrict what they could do with it during that grace period, not like out of some sort of sense that it needs to be punitive, but to sort of, because maybe that will provide a reminder that, oh, hey, things aren't working properly. In retrospect, there's not a lot we can actually restrict, and so I'm not sure how effective that is. So it may have been more effective to just have messaging around like now is the time you need to renew rather than the grace period tacked on. But I have seen it save people from losing their names, because maybe even just the psychological factor of basically we're telling you it expires 90 days before it actually expires. If you factor in the grace period, that gives people the enough time to have an oh shit moment and fix it, before it actually goes out to the public.
Yeah. And then also just the pricing for 5 characters and more ENS names at $5. Was there a reason for 5?
So I think the initial discussion was, well, most DNS names are about $10 a year, so maybe we should make it $10 a year. And then somebody was like, well, ENS is really early, so maybe they're about half as useful as DNS names, so we'll make them $5 a year. I would say probably most people get a lot more use out of their ENS names now than maybe DNS names, if they even have any. But it served to be a reasonable sort of shelling point, a reasonable tipping point. These days, gas fees tend to be a lot higher than the actual cost to register unless you're registering for a bunch of years at a time. And so, I wonder how, clearly it's priced a lot below what people would be willing to pay.
Yes.
But the goal of registrations isn't to bring in massive amounts of income for ENS. It's to prevent like mass registration of names people won't use.
Right.
And so I think for that it's set at a level that's, low enough that it's noise to people with gas fees these days, but high enough that doing that isn't necessarily affordable.
Yeah. And then in terms of the registration funds and what happens there, because it doesn't flow to the team, can you just quickly walk us through how that works?
Yeah, so like there's some core functionality that requires permissioning in ENS2, mostly for upgradability, but also for the funds, and those have been controlled from day one by a group of 7 key holders. I'm one of them, but the other 6 are all community members, not ENS team members. And so they have the right to decide how funds are distributed and used and so forth. And the overriding goal is like for the ENS ecosystem, but so far, like they haven't done a lot with them because I think there's a feeling that there's sort of a lack of legitimacy to make decisions with large amounts of it, so it sort of accumulates, but it's like, well, would it be legitimate for us to spend, $1 million on public good X? Do we have that sort of mandate, or are we just stewards of this money in sort of search of future decentralization, where something with more of a mandate can decide more authoritatively what to do with it? So far, the only thing that's happened to those funds is we funded Gitcoin to the tune of $700,000. Which was nice. Less nice was that it happened the day before Vitalik gave all his dog tokens to them, so it kind of got overshadowed a little bit.
Oh my goodness!
But that was kind of out of a desire to pay back some of the founding debt, if you like. Like the EF gave us very generous grants to get us going, and we kind of wanted to pay forward to help other parts of the community as well. And I think that would be a great motivation for ENS funds in general, is to help other public goods. And the other thing that's happened is a little while ago, during the initial sort of 2021 bull run, we sold a bunch of the ETH for USDC that still sits in the wallet, just out of a desire to, if there was a big crash, not end up, with not enough money to continue to run ENS. But that's all that's been done with it so far.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the ENS community is particularly amazing. I look at the website with the number of registrations and wallet holders, and it is a huge number. It's over 100,000 now, right? Is that correct?
Of registrations, yeah, by a long shot, I think.
Oh, so the number of active wallets with ENS names?
Right. Active wallets with ENS names is over 100,000. I think It's 110,000 now.
Yeah, incredible. So that would be a huge community kind of to draw on for, deciding what to do with the funds, which is really exciting, I think. And also just this idea of public goods, I feel like it's so obvious, and especially the Ethereum ecosystem, when just the ripples from a single project from funding us, and I mean ENS is a perfect example of this, and then seeing that go on to fund more public goods is something I'm really excited about and looking forward to. So yeah, that's really cool. Okie doke. Nick, thank you so much for your time. I know that now I don't want to take up any more of your time. I just want you to work on the subdomain name wrapper so that can get released, because that is definitely something I'm really, really excited about. I'm sure we'll talk again soon on another pod, and thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.